Hi. So today is the 12th lecture or the 12th tutorial session for the course I Think Biology offered on NPTL. It's offered by the Azim Premji University. And I am Geetika Agarwal. I'm a PhD scholar at the Center for Ecological Sciences. And I'll be taking this tutorial today. This will be the last tutorial for this course. And I hope you had fun learning about basics of biology and developing a little bit about this scientific thinking inside of you where you understand how biology works and how different elements in biology come in play to make the biosphere of the planet. So, for the last week, majorly discussed contents included the biology and society, in which they had a discussion with Dr. Suhail Kader, and then there was one discussion session about art and society, and a case study about stray dogs, and one lecture about nature relatedness. Right? So when you come to the first discussion with Dr. Kader, one of the questions posed to him was that what do you think about the way in which biology is being taught in schools and in undergrad colleges? And is there some changes that you would like um, there to be in the way sciences are being taught right now in the country? And if there were people present attending this lecture, I would have made this open to the audience for you guys to discuss it among yourselves. What do you think about this question, and how do you want biology to be changed in schools and colleges? But since it's just me, so I would give you my opinion about this question and a little bit about what Dr. Kader said. So, as far as we know about biology, is mostly thought of as a very information intense subject in which you learn a lot. You have to learn a bunch of facts, you have to learn a bunch of names about cells, some processes, and you have to get to know about, you have to make a lot of these diagrams, and you have to learn a lot of scientific names. And people mostly think that biology is a subject that involves a lot of cramming, in the sense, a lot of, learning, memorizing of information. But so a one way to change that is biology has a lot of these concepts, and it can be a very conceptual science if you teach it in that manner. And so if in schools or in undergrad levels, most of the science, instead of focusing on what cells, what scientific names, if there was more focus given to processes like evolution, like animal behavior, or like even the physics behind how cells function, central dogma, such processes, which are the underlying genetics, the underlying processes that actually make life as it is on the planet, then it would build more interest from the students. And if you keep it a little more interactive, in which students can ask questions, and like it's not just a factual answer that comes from the end. So a lot of these facts, when you have to memorize them, they fall in separate areas. But when you know about these concepts, you can thread together all these different facts in biology, and it makes it much easier for students to comprehend and to digest the information that's being put their way, right? So, for biology to be more accessible to students, what was suggested by Dr. Kadir as well was that these concepts should be highlighted while teaching to students. And one basic thing that he really nicely pointed out is that while teaching school kids, something important that educators or that, syllabus, the people who make the syllabus should keep in mind is that this is the knowledge that will stay with the person forever in their life. And at this point of life, students are very impressionable. So instead of teaching them these factual things, we should teach them some very basic things about society, about philosophy, about, sciences in general, and so that it helps them to make informed decisions as citizens when they grow up, to make decisions about themselves, to make decisions for the society, about the community, these things. So it's very important to introduce to students such concepts or such morals that makes them, very aligned towards what they want in their life, that helps them discover things. Another thing that happens in schools is that science is very uh, it's broken down into, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, and though it helps students learn in an organized manner about these different fields of science, but ultimately as you grow up and if you become a researcher, you realize that okay, biology is not all about biology. A lot of the processes happening in cells stem out from chemistry, and you need to know a lot of chemistry to digest the what is happening inside a cell. And a lot of the things that are happening even further level is actually physics. So as educators, we need to blur these boundaries between different scientific subjects, so that students are able to interlink how and understand how these different sciences actually go hand in hand, and none of these are isolated from each other. All of these sciences are actually linked together, and that is only how they should be taught to students, so that they're able to, while processing different phenomena, different observations that they make in their life, they're able to see how the biology that they're seeing actually has some underlying chemistry and physics going on, right? So these are some very important points or crucial points that were put forth by Dr. Kader during this discussion. And these were some changes that he would really that he suggested should be made in schools. And another thing that I also feel should be changed about school education for biology is, as Dr. Kadir said, it should be made a little bit more interactive. Students should be taken out for like field trips to like, or like on nature walks and things like that, where they're actually put out of the classroom setting, put out of the textbook setting. That is correct that okay, fine, we learn about all of these things from our textbooks, but we actually need to step out into the wild to see what is it that we are learning in the textbook. So students should be taken out on these nature walks, so that they're actually able to observe their nature. And the educators should be able to teach, I would say you should teach the students how to observe nature. A lot of the times you will see we are living with nature, we have everything around us. We have birds, we have butterflies, we have so many types of insects and amphibians and reptiles. But if you pick up some school kid, or a 10th grade student, they will not be able to recognize a lot of these species, a lot of these plant species, a lot of these bird species or animal species around them, apart from the very generic ones like dogs and cats, or like parrots, things like that. But it's very important for us as individuals, as human beings, to be able to identify the richness of biodiversity that exists around us. Only then we'll be able to uh, only then we'll be able to appreciate the fact that our earth, our planet, our own country is so biodiverse, and there are so many species of organisms that live around us, and they all have their own ecosystem services that they play. They all have their own roles in this ecosystem in which we live. And it's very important as students for us to understand this, and to internalize this, that we are not the supreme species on the planet. We are not the only one in the planet. It's not just all about us. There are so many other species that we live alongside it, and we are just a mere speck in the biodiversity of the earth. There are so many other things happening. So it's important for educators to make this known to the students, to make them aware about the amount of biodiversity that exists on this planet, and to take them out on nature walks, introduce them, teach them how to observe different things, teach them how to see how different organisms are behaving, how or if you're teaching them about disease spread or things like that, it's important to give them a hands-on experience about everything that's happening around us. So it's very important, I feel, at this point, for schools to get out of the textbook mode of education, and to take students towards more about exploring what is happening out there, right? So these are some things that were discussed during the lecture, and that I would also like to point out, which are important for students to know. And these are some things that need to be changed right now. Okay. And there are some important, like biology currently is a very important subject, because there are some very important things happening to this planet. For example, in the last week we discussed about the climate change crisis. And as long as you don't as long as the students are not made aware about climate change and how it's coming about, and what are the different biological phenomena that that are being disturbed, or that have a role to play in influencing the climate and need to be maintained, and how, for example, we learned about urbanscapes in this course, and about how city we learned about how city itself is an organism. It needs to be taught to the students, so that they know how these different things are functioning. Where is they are producing all this waste, where is it going, what is happening to everything that they're consuming in their daily lives. So students need to be made aware about this so that they are able to understand how different things are functioning, and what how different elements of the ecosystem are connected, biotic, abiotic, are connected to each other, and how our actions in general have a role to play in everything. Even in the climate change, our actions will have a little bit of a role to play, and if students are made aware about this fact, only then will they be, as we know, they are at that impressionable age, and if they understand something, they'll be able to take it home, tell their parents that, yeah, this is something we learned in the school, and I think we should, you know, say it's a very basic thing. I think we should start segregating wet waste from dry waste and things like that. It's very important for students to internalize these things, that it's important how these things function, and we need to know how to make a change about all of this, how how renewable energy functions. But that's it. Like when we talk about environmental sciences, students are just made aware about alternatives, like, okay, fine, there is solar power, there's wind energy, there's water energy, things like that. But there are pros and cons to these things also, which do not come to their knowledge. So students should also be taught about, okay, yes, there are windmills, there is wind energy, but it also has its own consequences. When huge chunks of land are made barren to set up windmills, when birds are getting affected by it, when reptiles are getting affected by it, when the local people are getting affected by it, these science and society kind of things need to be highlighted even in school level of knowledge. And I don't think it's going to be very complex for students to comprehend, because that is not the case. It's just depends on how the educators are putting their point through, how it is brought to the notice of the students so that they understand what is going on, and how different things are functioning together, right? Another thing is that biology is not just about fine environment. There's also a huge medicinal factor that comes in, and a huge part of it is biotechnology, in which a lot of these medicines are being developed, a lot of these cures are getting developed, a lot of things like um how to help specially able people, how to help handicapped people. A lot of these tech is coming into biology, and it's coming in different aspects of biology. And so genetic engineering, for example, take some basic examples of genetic engineering in crops, how these crops become temperature resistant, they can become pest resistant, but how then pests are able to overcome this, and how this cycle keeps on continuing. All of these needs to be taught to children so that they, or taught to students, sorry, so that they make a informed decision. And schools need to focus on developing the skills of critical thinking and analysis, so that students can make an informed decision when they become adults and step into the society. And yeah, that is something that is important. And when we talk about colleges and the way biology is taught in the college, one important thing that Dr. Suhail pointed out is that we specialize too soon and too early when it comes to college teaching. Like very early on, we take into thinking that, okay, fine, we're going to become a geneticist, and we don't take anything else into account. We just talk about genetics after that point on. So it's very important to keep the basics degrees of like undergrad as broad as possible, so that students get a flavor of everything that's happening in the subject, and they understand how to link different things. What is animal behavior? How the animal is behaving is actually controlled by different neuronal pathways, or different ways the hormones are functioning in the animal, how it is, or it might be genetically innate behavior, something like that. So all of these things are actually linked in the end, and for students to understand this linking, they need to know the very basics of every field in biology itself also. So it would be very nice for students to be introduced to the subject as a broader life science subject, in which they're taught about everything that's happening in biology. And along with that, it's also important for biologists, and not just biologists, every science student to also learn philosophy. And why we're talking about philosophy is that some things are very important to be understood philosophically. For example, Dr. Kader talked about epistemology, which is the science, or which is the philosophy in which you talk about how do we know what we know. So these are some kinds of philosophies that students need to be made to think of. Like it's very important for them to be introduced to these concepts, so that they can think about things like, okay, yeah, how do we know? or like how are we perceiving the world? What we are perceiving, is that actually the truth? Do we even know what is reality? Because there's another thing about called the umwelt, that is basically that whatever, that your reality is actually what you are perceiving. And this might not be same for everybody, because everybody is perceiving their own world, and everybody's realities are actually quite different from each other's, because everything depends on how you are perceiving the world. So while conducting science, you cannot directly uh, imply your own understanding to everybody's understanding. For example, if you think that, okay, yeah, you observe some bird, say, pecking on the ground, you can't just interpret it solely based on your observations. You also need to understand it from their perspective, that what might be going on, right? So these are some things that are important to be taught at the school level and at the UG college level. And this would make it easier for students to comprehend biology, and will make it less of a difficult science and less of a memorizing science, but more concept based, so that they're able to link together all these different facts that we teach them, right? Then the next question was about uh, science practice in India, and who are the decision makers when it comes to science practicing science in India. And actually, it's not just applicable to India. In any country, the decision makers of science is actually happens at very different levels, the decision making. And at the very broad level, it happens, if we're talking about on the country level, then there's obviously a committee of scientists that function at the country level, who, based on their own opinions and based on what is going on in the world, decide which are the important fields at that point, what are the priorities of the government at that point, and those are the facets of science that they will be funding for that particular year, or for those that particular time period in which they are functioning. And so so they come up with a strategy behind how they want the science of the country to function. And then based on that, they fund certain fields of science more compared to the others. And because government is a primary funder when it comes to science practice, especially in India, so it depends on the country level. And then when you come down to it, depends on the institute level, what an institute uh, uh, wants the educators in that, or the researchers in the institute, to carry out and do, and what kind of a research is being promoted on the institute level. And then comes the individual decision making, in which we talk about the individuals, for example, the professors or the researchers who are running their own labs. Then they will decide what kinds of questions they want to ask in their own lab, and they want their students to be answering. And then we come on a further individual level, which is like students, for example, somebody who's carrying out their own PhD. Then it depends on them what kind of questions they want to ask, what are they interested in, and what do they think is important about the science that they want to carry out. So these are the different factors, or the different levels of decision makers. And the kinds of decisions that make are going to be very different, because it depends again on their own perception of the world. So at some point the government might be supporting something, at some other point some other thing, because it depends on the people that are functioning at that level. And every person has their own world view. And so what questions are being asked is very deeply impacted by the amount of diversity that exists at these different levels. So if you have a lot of diversity, say gender diversity, caste diversity, or economic diversity, that is when a lot of diversity will come in the questions being asked in the country. For example, if all the researchers, at least right now, a lot of the researchers in India come from privileged backgrounds. They come from families that support research, or they have money to undertake research as an individual. And so their concerns will be different from somebody coming from a very different background. For example, somebody who's a first generation researcher in their family and has not seen this before. So their upbringing and their outlook towards the world would be very different. Their worldview will be very different. And so the questions that they come up with will also be very different. For example, for time, especially so for example, for a long time in India, or in general in ecology, in science practice and animal behavior, when they were looking at bird behavior and mating practices, for a long time the researchers were just looking at the male aspect, the male behavior, because the males in not just in birds, in other animals, in ungulates or in mammals and everything, the males are the ones that have these outstanding or these very you know behaviors that stand out, these standout behaviors for attracting their mates, right? And so, and a lot of, and so these, they were thought to be the important ones in the mating processes, and in attracting mates and all of that reproductive process. And the females in these species were not studied at all, because they looked kind of dull and they didn't seem to be making many decisions. But that was only because a lot of the researchers at the time were also males, and they just did not pay attention to the to what is happening in the with the females of the species. And when female ecologists started stepping into the field, they started seeing what is going on. Then they observed that, okay, why are we just looking at one aspect of this, and why are we not looking at what the females bring to the table, how the females are making decisions in reproductive biology. And that is when we came to know about a lot of these, female driven selection and things happening, and how females are also making very important decisions, how in some species females are also fighting for access to mates, and a lot of these different phenomena got highlighted. So diversity in, even in the researchers or even in the people that are conducting science, is very important, because only then will different questions come to the table. So yeah, these are some important things that were pointed out during this discussion. And the next question that was asked was about the biology practices in India, and how do you think that Indian scientists should be asking questions, and should they be asking questions which are different from the questions being asked in the Western world? And yeah, so should Indian scientists be actually asking questions that are different from the questions in Western world? And to this, Dr. Kadar's answer was that it really actually depends on at what level the science is being practiced. If you're talking about applied biology, if you're talking about coming up with medicines, coming up with vaccinations, then of course the um, scientists in India would be paying more attention to the diseases that are present in India, and not just on a global level. Like that would be our priority at that point. But so the questions therefore are different, and also because the amount of money that we have as a country is not comparable to the amount of money present in the Western world. The kind of tech that they can use, that they can utilize while carrying out research, is very different to the type of tech that we can use. So the way we approach questions, and we approach how to answer them, would be very different to the way the Western world's researchers do that, because they have a lot of these resources in hand available to them. So it's very different for how we do it. But the basic sciences that are carried out, they're actually very curiosity driven sciences. And um they they are very curiosity driven, and people in general will ask those questions then based on what they are interested in. So at that point, it doesn't matter if they're Western world or if they're come from the global south or the global north. It basically depends on what is driving them to conduct science. And a lot of the times it's seen that some questions that are being asked in the West by the use of a lot of technology, actually Indians or like people coming from developing countries, they come up with solutions to answering these questions by utilizing minimum resources, because that is what we have, the minimum amount of resources in our hand. So that is how the questions that we ask in India as biologists are actually quite different from the questions being asked in the Western world. And this is what was discussed. Then moving on to how do we look at nature and how do we look at biology, and should that be changed? Should we change our outlook towards nature? So one thing was that while we look at nature, a lot of the times humans try to justify their own actions by just quoting nature, by saying that okay, something is natural means that something is good, means that something is inevitable. That because it's natural, it's inevitable. This is how it's supposed to be. And it has been used a lot of the times to justify things that should not be backed up at all. Things like slavery, things like oppression, socioeconomic, racial, or gender biases. All these things were actually are most of the time justified by trying to use nature. And there's this concept called the naturalistic fallacy, in which they talk about what is also ought to be, which means that what is happening is actually what is supposed to happen. Like that is how it is. But that is not true. And nature is not uniform. When people try and justify their actions, they try and come up with only one type of examples, and they only try to see in nature what they want to see. But that is not true. Nature always has a plethora of examples which are very different from the way you are thinking, from the way different people are thinking. And so you can come up with examples of anything and justify anything based in that sense, based on nature. But are um, since we have this human construct of ethics, which, like, animals don't have ethics, but we know our ethics because we have made this human construct of ethics. We should you know utilize this ethical thinking inside of us. We should develop this ethical thinking and do things that we think are ethically correct to be doing, and not engage in other practices and just justify them by saying that yeah, it's natural. Because not everything, like, nature is not there to justify our actions and our intents and our wants. That is not the case. We should change our outlook towards nature, and we should be accepting towards everything that's present in nature. Because if you look at it, there are so many different examples out there which will justify so many different actions. And then why are we not doing the good things and then saying that yeah, because this happens in nature, we should also do this, right? So yeah, that is how we should change our outlook. And mostly there's this rule that we are always taught even as kids, that you should behave with others the way you want them to behave with you. So that is how we should also behave with other humans and other non-human animals, the biodiversity around us. The way, like, we should try and put ourselves in their shoes and understand their um, plight and understand their condition, and see where they're coming from and what is going on before we come to any conclusions. So as humans, we're very flexible, we're very malleable, because we have a lot of this brain capacity, a lot of thinking that we can do. We have this imaginative powers, so we should be able to use that, and then make our decisions, right? So our outlook towards nature should be a little different from the one that we are currently following. And the last question in this discussion was about scientific temper and rationality, and how that goes against beliefs in metaphysical knowledge. So, like, are these two things completely non overlapping? Does scientific temper have nothing to do with metaphysical knowledge or with the religious beliefs that we have? Are those completely irrational? Like, most of the times, you see that these things go hand in hand. Like, a lot of the scientists are actually have religious beliefs. They believe in religion, they believe in these metaphysical things. So there are two outlooks that come when you're talking about science and religion. And one of them is that religion and science are completely non-overlapping subjects. There is nothing common between religion and science, and they should be kept that way. Other thing is that other people think that okay, religion is actually making claims about the physical world, and we can prove or disprove these claims because they fall in the realm of science. The physical world falls into the realm of science. So as scientists, our duty to prove or disprove these different claims that are being made by religion. But as far as it becomes comes to scientific temper and the beliefs, I think it is a very individualistic approach to it. Every person has their own beliefs, has their own scientific temper, and you cannot actually change someone's beliefs. You can always talk to them, you can always try and explain your side of the scenario, but you can't really impose them to believe in what you believe. For example, the example was given about COVID 19, and during COVID, um, because a lot of these discoveries were actually coming in place. So earlier it was thought that okay, yeah, COVID is being spread by dirty surfaces, and people were told to clean and wipe every surface, everything that they consume before they consume it, and wipe all the surfaces in their place so as to prevent COVID. And people were doing that. They were following the scientific part of it, but they were also doing the religious part of it, because that is what makes them feel good. That is what calms them down. And it's okay if they're doing this and if they're doing that, if as long as they're keeping it to themselves and they're not implying it on others, their own beliefs, then I guess it should be fine for everyone to believe in what they believe in. So that is how scientific temper differs from religious beliefs. So some people think they're non-overlapping. Some people think that they're actually uh, related to each other. Then the next lecture was about a discussion with Dr. Ipsa Jain. Dr. Ipsa Jain is actually a science illustrator who does a lot of art with science, and she illustrates pieces, articles for scientists, and she's also illustrated the I Think Biology book, which is the course book for this course. And so in that lecture, they discussed about what is the historical link between science and art, and she told us that how uh, like in the earlier times science was actually very much interlinked with art, and a lot of the scientists actually came up with a lot of discoveries by their art pieces that they made. And so she gave an example of Galileo, who actually came up with who like his contemporaries was observing the moon, and while all these contemporaries failed to actually acknowledge the presence of these craters and their shadows on the moon, but Galileo, because he was very observant and he knew a little bit of art, he knew about shadows and painting, he came up with the illustration of the surface of the moon, which is actually very accurate to what we see today, or to what we know to be true by all our space journeys to the moon. So science and art are very have been linked for a long time. Even before that, I would say, when humans used to be like when early man, when we used to be living in caves, then also a lot of the times humans used to observe the nature around them, and they used to make these cave paintings in which you could see a lot of these illustrations of these different animals, these different ungulates, cattle, and humans either interacting with them either in hunts or by domesticating them, and these different things you observe. So I would say that is also a part of observation and science. And if you uh, there are a lot of these old scientists who actually used to go out into the field, and they used to observe, say, insect behavior. There's this person who observed that, okay, earlier it was thought that caterpillar are actually different organisms and compared to the butterflies, and it was only after one of the scientists actually went to the field and saw the entire life cycle of the butterfly did she figure out that, okay, the caterpillar is actually becoming the pupa, and then from the pupa emerges the butterfly. So all of these are the different life cycles of the same organism. So illustration plays a very important role, even if you're talking about looking at cells while observing them through a microscope. It's important for people to observe properly what is in front of their eyes. And if you try and illustrate it, it'll make a connection from your brain to your hand, and you'll understand how what you see, you will be able to put it down on paper or wherever you want to draw, and you'll able to understand how different things are happening. And if you say you have a group of 10 people observing the same thing, and you tell them to draw that, you will see that all of them will might be observing some component of it very closely, and all of them will come up with a different image of that same thing. So if you actually disintegrate this idea of the fact that you have to copy the image that you see in the textbook exactly, and that is the correct way of drawing diagrams, then only will be able to break out of this idea, and then only will students actually start observing properly what they see. Because art should actually be free, and people and like students in the school level only should actually be led towards this view that, okay, whatever you see, you have to make it in your own by the way you are interpreting it, right? What you're observing, you put that down, and don't just copy what is there in the book, in the textbooks. So even historically, art has played a very important role in scientists' life. For example, even when you see the illustrations of the small insects in, like we discussed in the lecture of Leeuwenhoek, he made a lot of these insect illustrations. There was this person called Henry J. Lefebvre who used to actually observe insects and wasp life cycles in his backyard, and he used to draw all of them. And so science and art have been very closely linked, and scientists have used art to actually come up with ideas and to brainstorm ideas. So yeah, these two cannot be should not be teased apart, and they should actually be linked. And scientific art over time has changed. Earlier in the days, it was mostly observational art, like as I said, scientists used to step out, or observers, naturalists used to step out into the field, into the jungle, into the outdoors, into the backyard, observe what they are seeing and draw it. But nowadays what is happening is a lot of the people are actually drawing what they think are the predictions, or how they think are this is something happening. So the art is actually evolving over time, and over time the contemporary art is actually trying to discover new things through the art. And how do you use design and scientific process to take science to the masses, and how do you develop scientific thinking among students? So as I said, that students should actually be provoked, or should actually be made to think about things more thoroughly as compared to just following the textbook, just following the textbook diagrams. Should actually expose them to the experiences. Again, you can take them out of the field, you can take them, you can try them, ask them to sit with their journals and do some nature journaling to observe what they're seeing and actually put it down with a pen and a paper into their notebook. And maybe you can put some insect specimen and ask all the classroom students to draw that. So they will all be observing different things. Some of them might be interested more in their antennae, some of them might be interested in their legs, some of them might be interested in their wings, some of them might be interested in their eyes. So there are these different things that will pop out of those things, and you will be students will be able to make out what they're interested in more, and teachers will also be able to teach differently in a more interactive manner to all of these students. And while designing, it's not just about designing drawings, it's about art in general. It's about, it can be about designing some games, some art, some structures, some sculptures, many things. It just needs to be like, and also it is more appealing, art is more appealing to the masses. If you're talking about, if you think about teaching somebody some phenomena, if you have a group of 10 students and you're just teaching them via words, the same things, versus if you're teaching them via illustrations, if you're teaching them via some act, via some play, then you see the group of students who would have been taught by words would retain much less as compared to a group of students who had been taught the same phenomena, say via an act out. So it's very important to link science and art, so that students develop this scientific temperament but also do not lose their artistic side. Like these days, even if some of a few or some students are good at art, they're actually mostly treated as a hobby, and that is not how it should be. um, because there are many ways of, linking your art and making it into a profession. And Dr. Ipsa was saying that even though there are very few science and art courses in India, but what students can do is actually pursue art as some graphics designing courses or some art courses. And then, if you have some scientific temperament, try and link science with that, and try. You can find a lot of these scientific illustrators, and you can actually write to them, reach out to them, and ask them if they can, take you on as interns. And you might get a better experience and a first hand experience to something that you really enjoy. And as we said, you should be fostering observational sketching among students. As I said, like if you just tell them to copy the sketch that's there in the book, that is not how they will learn, and that is not how things in reality actually look like. A lot of the times things look very different, and it's important for students to be able to observe keenly what is happening in front of them. For as researchers, what we want is, we want to observe everything as closely as possible, so that we're able to come up with the reasons behind what is happening, why it's happening, how it's happening. For that, we need to have very keen observation skills. And for students to develop these keen observation skills, they should actually be taught to observe something in reality, and then try and interpret it, try and take it down on paper. Right. Coming to the third lecture of this week, it talked about stray dogs and how do we coexist with these organisms around us. So stray dogs, as you might have seen them around you, you might actually like them. If you are an animal lover, if you're a dog lover, you might enjoy feeding them. You might see a lot of people around you feeding these dogs. Or you might see some people actually being very scared of dogs, some people flinching at the sound of a dog barking, some people trying to avoid dogs, or you might even see some people who are hitting dogs, who are driving them away, who are shouting at them. So there are a lot of these different human perspectives that we have towards stray dogs and stray animals in general. And uh, so we'll discuss about those, or the during this uh, session. But a way of defining stray dogs, or the way stray dogs have been defined, is that stray dogs are actually domestic dogs which have bonded with humans. They have some social bonds with humans, but then they got abandoned on the street, and now they do not have any direct supervision or human care. And then children born out of, or born from these stray dogs, from these abandoned dogs, they would never have had a bond with the humans, and they would now become feral dogs, right? So stray dogs actually have a bond with humans, but they had gotten abandoned from their houses, and now the future generations would actually be feral dogs. But there are many different perspectives, as I discussed, that we take towards stray dogs. But how do these stray dogs spread? How are they related? We've seen in so many news reports that, okay, some kid got mauled by stray dogs, or somebody got attacked, somebody got bit, somebody going on a bike. And a lot of the times you see that some bike hit the dogs, some car hit the dog, something like that, accidents happening on the road because of these increasing number of stray dogs in the cities, in urban areas. But there are reasons behind why these numbers of stray animals are actually increasing in the urban areas, and there are different ways in which they are linked. One study actually looked at the correlation between humans and the amount of waste that they produce. So in this graph, you see that there is the human population on the y-axis, and there is the different cities on the x-axis. And you see in Mumbai, where you have the maximum amount of human population, you also have a lot of waste production. And then you see that waste production is sort of correlated with this is municipal solid waste, MSW, this blue line, and sort of correlated with human population. And then there was this another plot in which you see dog population and dog bites, and you see that they're not actually very clearly correlated. Like dog bites and dog population is not correlated. This blue line shows you the number of dog bites in a city, and this red bars show you the dog population. So even though Hyderabad has a high amount of dog population, you have very few cases of dog bites compared to Mumbai, for example, which has very few dogs but a lot of cases of dog bites, right? So these two are not very well correlated. But if you look at these two blue lines, you see that the blue lines are kind of co correlated. That the amount of waste there is kind of correlated with the number of dog bites. So you can sort of think about it in the way that where there is a lot of municipal wastes, there are kind of a lot of dogs, but still you cannot make it out clearly, because an important concept is that correlation is not causation. So these two are some very different terms and should not be confused. Correlation is not causation at all. For example, there is this line: the dinosaurs didn't read and now they are extinct. There are these two statements. So these are two statements, but they're not at all linked to each other. Like, okay, yeah, dinosaurs could not read, but that is not the reason why they're extinct, right? So correlation cannot be thought of as causation. For example, there's this one example: the faster that windmills are observed to rotate, the more wind is also observed. So when you observe windmills, if they're rotating fast, which means that wind is also fast. So therefore, wind is caused by the rotation of windmills. So you would already know that, yeah, that is not true, because windmills are actually work because of the wind. Because the wind is blowing fast, that is why the windmills are rotating faster. So even though these two things are correlated, that the windmills are going faster and we are observing more wind, does not mean that they have a causal relationship, or does not mean that um, like A causes B does not mean B also causes A, right? And there's another example: since the 1950s, both atmospheric carbon dioxide levels and obesity levels have increased sharply. So if you observe since 1950s, carbon dioxide is increasing and obesity is also increasing. So, but that does not mean that atmospheric carbon dioxide is causing obesity, right? So even though these two things are correlated, the carbon dioxide levels and the obesity levels, but they're not, one is not the reason for causing the other, right? So correlation is not causation. So a way to describe is that the inability to legitimately deduce a cause and effect relationship between two events or variables solely on the basis of an observed association or a correlation. So if you observe a correlation or an association between two things, you still cannot legitimately deduce a cause and effect relationship between these two things. Okay, these two things are not related to each other by cause. Okay, for example, if you say that, okay, fine, the number of trees in the cities are going down, right? And the second thing, you say, okay, the traffic amount is going up. So you cannot say that because of decreasing trees, the traffic is going high in the city. That is not the case, right? It's not because of decreasing trees that the traffic is increasing in the city. So these two things might be correlated, but they're not. They One of them is not the reason for the other thing, right? Okay, so but what are the different? So that was a little bit of a digression from the stray dog story. Coming to the stray dog story, what are the different causes of increased stray dogs in urban habitats? Why are we having increased stray dogs? Again, you see a very scary graph here in which you see that Maharashtra has such a high number of dog bites in just 1 year of 2022, right? So there are, what are the causes of increased stray dogs? So there is lack of sterilization, that is correct, right? So dogs are not getting sterilized properly, and the municipalities are not able to do their job in which they should actually be sterilizing or neutering these dogs so that they are not able to multiply so fast in number. The wastes are not getting managed, so a lot of these times, the if you see waste bins, the waste is spread everywhere, and it's not actually, in covered bins. There are so many landfills, and so when there is so many open dumps which are actually overflowing with the wastes, that provides a lot of resources for these stray animals to multiply in numbers and stay, right? And a lot of these actually sterilization programs, even if they're being carried out by the municipality, they're very underfunded, and that's why they're not able to cover the entire population. And if even if you leave a few dogs unsterilized, they can actually lead to the multiplication of dog numbers. And urban habitats are actually expanding. Urbanization is pushing animals out of their natural habitats, and that's what brings them to the urban areas. And it's not just about urban areas. When you talk about urban areas, maybe the properly urbanized zones are actually very well managed by the municipality, and these stray animals are quite in check. But when you move a little out, when the city is expanding, for example, in the middle of Bangalore, but versus the outer parts of Bangalore which are spreading outside, right? Um, so these peri-urban zones, these are the ones in which a lot of these new areas, new restaurants are coming up, which brings new avenues, new waste products, new food sources for these animals. And that is why the numbers are increasing, because of the expansion of cities and these peri-urban zones. And a lot of these domestic pets and livestock get abandoned by people when they're not able to take care of them. And when they abandon these, they actually just uh, become stray, and they then are just left to the roads, right? Nobody's taking care of them. And then last but not the least is lack of some strict animal ownership laws, that people, if they are owning some animals, they cannot just leave them out in the open for them to become stray, right? There should be some strict laws and some enforcement of these laws also. So these are some causes of some increased amount of stray dogs that we observe around us in our surroundings. And there is this paper called Canine Conundrum by Home, Bhatnagar, and Vanak, in which they actually talk about how domestic dogs are acting as an invasive species, and they're having some very jarring impacts on the wildlife of India. So in this graph, you see that this is the negative impact. Which species are dogs actually impacting negatively? And you see that there are so many mammal species, so many birds and reptile species that are being negatively impacted, and not and mammals also, ungulates, carnivores, primates, all of these species are actually being very negatively impacted by birds, by dogs, could either be just by directly killing them, or by actually taking away their natural habitats and their resources, because the dogs are increasing in number so much, right? So you can go ahead and check out this paper to understand more about how domestic dogs are now becoming sort of like are acting like an invasive species in India. And they are spreading in numbers so much, and they're good at utilizing resources. They're kind of generalistic. They can feed on anything. Like some people can be, you'll see they're feeding them rice, some people are feeding them milk, some people are feeding them rotis, some people are feeding them chicken. And dogs are able to they are thriving on all of these resources. So they are behaving as they are like generalist species which are taking over the habitats, and it's making it difficult for other native species to be, um, adjusting to this change. But okay, even if we have discussed so many negative implications of the increasing number of stray dogs in the environment, they do have their positives, and they do play some ecological services. For example, they act as a natural pest control. And why do I say like a natural pest control is because the stray dogs, they are actually helping control rodent populations. A lot of these stray dogs, a lot of these feral dogs actually eat, or they depend on these rodent populations as a food source, and they prey upon them, and this keeps these populations in check, and these rodent populations then cannot harm our fields, or they cannot the pest numbers are decreased, and it also reduces the amount of chemical pesticides that we have to use, which gives us a healthier environment. And they act as scavengers and bring balance to the ecology. The stray dogs, they have a very important scavenging role, with which they add back nutrients to the biological cycles, to the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycles. And because they decompose these organic wastes, they consume a lot of waste, a lot of animal carcasses and things like that, and they aid in nutrient cycling in the environment. Last and very important point is the human well-being. A lot of these stray dogs, they actually offer some emotional support and some social benefits to the communities, and a lot of people can have them as their informal companions. And even if they're feeling lonely, or if they live alone, or if they do not have enough money to actually own their own domestic pets, they're able to drive that joy out of these stray dogs, and because they're associated with them, right? So it brings in the part of human well-being. So this was all about these stray dogs, and the last lecture was about nature relatedness, or something which is also called the inclusion of nature in self, how we are related to the nature around us, or how we should foster this relatedness in ourselves. And this inclusion of nature in self is kind of a scale which rates it in these seven different levels. One being that we are completely different, separate from nature, and the last one being that we are completely immersed in nature. We are nature and nature is us. And it also depends on an individual opinion how you view this inclusion of nature in yourself. Like, if you are somebody who's very enthusiastically nature oriented, who thinks about nature all the time, then you might fall on G, F, or E. But if you're somebody who does not think of nature at all, then you would be somewhere in A, B, right? So this is something, but we should actually foster our future generations. We should foster kids to become more and more oriented towards nature, to learn about nature, to address these, so that they're able to address these different questions and concerns. And we should also try and address these concerns of climate change, about biodiversity loss, habitat loss, and these different things. And we should be concerned about these things, and think about nature as well. Because currently we are living in a capitalocene, in which the era of capitalism. And you can see here this diagram which shows the pyramid of the capitalist system, in which we see that there is capitalism in which some people, they rule others, some people, they live by fooling others, some people, they live by fighting others, some people, they actually just enjoy their meals, and then there are a lot of these general class which is actually working for everyone and feeding everyone. So there's these different pillars of capitalism. One of them is the free market, the laissez-faire economy. Then there is a limitless growth, so there is no limit to the amount of money that can be made. There is limited government intervention. Government can only intervene to some limited point. So capitalism actually is the thought, or is the paradigm in which you talk about owning things, which are being things that are owned by individuals and not owned as a community by everyone. And talks about consumerism, like we buy a lot of things, and right now we're living in a very capitalist society in which we own the land, we own the water that we drink, we own the food that we consume, we own the clothes that we wear. So everything is very individualistically owned, and you know it's very individual oriented thought process, and nothing is like thought of as an entire community. So those are some things. And so it talks about private property, owning your own land, and which government cannot take, like has no part in, nobody else, no, the community has no part in. Mostly talks about self interest, mostly competition. You're always competing with your peers for having more land, having more commodities. So mostly health and wealth and happiness is actually measured by the amount of commodities that you own in this capitalist society. There's a lot of competition, there's a lot of freedom of choice. So these are some different pillars of capitalism, and capitalism currently is the dominant social paradigm. So to explain to you the dominant social paradigm is actually, they are the prevailing set of beliefs. They are the beliefs and the norms that are currently accepted worldwide, and they form a part of the worldview, and they actually justify the current social structure that exists. And currently capitalism is a dominant social paradigm. And what is happening here is that in capitalism we think about individuals before we think about communities. So when you're thinking about something, when thinking about owning land, when thinking about owning water as a resource, owning air, all these things are thought of on an individual level, and we don't think about as a community. We don't think about the community well-being, about how people living together might different people, because they come from different economic backgrounds, they might be impacted by these things at different levels, but we are only concerned with individuals. And as an individual, I can own anything that I want to own because of capitalism. Then there is private ownership over, commonly owning something, like a particular individual is the owner of that land, is the owner of a car, is the owner of a space, and like not an entire community. Like for example, even if you're working in an office space and you go to that office every day, you sort of almost live there. It's your workspace, but you cannot own it. You do not even own a part of it. That entire thing is owned by the person who owns the company, right? So it's about private ownership and material goods over everything else, over the important relationships that we have. um, Material goods over the relationships that we have with our, which are actually important for humans. So we mostly, as I said, we mostly measure happiness by the commodities that we own, and not uh, uh, by the health, or by the good amount of good relationships that we have with our peers. And we thought humans are thought of being as completely separate from nature. So these are some things about capitalism. But we should keep in mind all the different ecological services that we get from nature, which would be impossible if we were supposed to do them all on our own. So we are taking so much from the nature, but we're not giving, or not, we're not even taking care of nature. So there are some of these ecological services that we should keep in mind. And we should always appreciate what we are getting from nature before, and not try to exploit it, but try and live with it in harmony. So nature is, so it can be divided into four of these categories. One of them is provisioning, then regulating, cultural activities, and supporting activities. So nature is provisioning to us many goods. For example, we get our food from nature, we get water from nature, we get medicines, wood, pulp, all these things we get from nature. So nature actually is provisioning all these things to us, and we're just taking them without actually returning anything back to it. It regulates a lot of these things. So a lot of these biogeochemical cycles, nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, they regulate the climate, they maintain pure water, they lead to pollination. For example, bees are pollinating all these plants without us telling it to. And if you actually hire humans to go and pollinate all these plants that are actually these huge amounts of forests that are being pollinated by birds and insects, if you actually put humans to that use, your entire, like, you will not be able to pay them ever. So it's like an immense amount of job that nature is doing for us for free, and we still not appreciate it. And controlling erosion, if you actually, yeah, there is so much amount of erosion that would happen if nature was not there to actually control for it, if trees were not there to hold the soil together. So there's so many benefits that we derive from the ecosystem without even realizing that we're taking them from our, and nature, from our environment. So we should always think about, keep these things in the back of our mind, always keep thinking about how, if something is happening, how nature is playing an important role in that. Cultural roles, for example, we talk about tourism, talk about recreation, talk about spirituality, talk about getting calm, getting your zen when you're there in the forest, when you're there in the jungle, or if you're there out there, if you're walking and you're breathing in fresh air, if you're going on a trek, you're actually deriving all these intangible benefits from ecosystem, which you cannot place a cost on, but they're actually calming you down and bringing you mental well-being. And nature is actually providing you habitat, providing us a habitat to sustain, providing a lot of these species, the immense number of species that exist, them a habitat, and to maintain genetic diversity, which is very important for humans also, for their survival. So there are so many of these ecological services that we just miss out on, we do not pay attention to them, but it's very important to keep an eye out for how things are happening, right? Now, coming to the environmentalists in India and some of the local movements that were carried out by Indian environmentalists. So, first, I'll talk about these local movements. So, India has been, since we are such a biodiverse country and a lot of our land is covered with, we have four biodiversity hotspots: the Himalayas, the Western Ghats, the Sundaland. We have four of these biodiversity hotspots, and we have so much biodiversity in our country, and there are so many people, and we are still trying to coexist with the biodiversity. We're trying to maintain our forest. We're trying our way best to reduce the amount of habitat loss that has happened so far for these species. So there has been these efforts by environmentalists even in the past. So some of these local movements I will highlight in this slide. One of them was the Bishnoi movement, which happened in 1700 AD. It was a movement against deforestation, which was being ordered by the Maharaja of Jodhpur because he wanted to fell an entire forest in order to build his own palace. But these Bishnoi women who came from this tribe called Bishnoi, they actually stepped up and they protected the forest and did not let the Maharaja destroy that forest. So that's the Bishnoi movement. Then is the Chipko movement, which was actually pioneered by Sundarlal Bahuguna. He was like one of the frontiers for these movements. He launched it, and it happened in Uttarakhand in the Chamoli district. And here, what happened? It was again a grassroots level women movement. Again, it was started by women, just like the women in the Bishnoi tribe. Here also in the Chipko movement, the women of the area, they started hugging the trees in order to protect them from being cut, because a sports good manufacturing industry wanted to set up in that zone, and they wanted to so all these forests were being cut down by some sports goods manufacturing industry. But these women came forward. They were led by Sundarlal Bahuguna, who played a very important role in Chipko movement, and they prevented this entire forest from being cut down. This happened sometime in 1973. There's also the Silent Valley movement, in which the environmentalists and the local people, they very strongly objected to the Hydel power project, which was being set up in Kerala in the Silent Valley forest. Eventually, it was made into the Silent Valley Reserve, in which is now a reserved area, and nothing can happen there. But a lot of these environmentalists came forth and they put their point that if you build a Hydel project there, it will drown a very big part of the tropical evergreen forest in Kerala. It will impact so many species, and eventually the government stepped back and they did not build that Hydel project. So it is up to the citizens to take an action, and to protect the nature against the decisions of uh, you know a few powerful people. If we come together, we can do anything. 1982 happened this Jungle Bachao movement, in which a tribal community of Jharkhand, it was agitated at the forest policy of the government, and because they wanted to replace the soil and forest with high priced teak, so they wanted to convert it into a teak plantation. But the local people of Jharkhand, the tribal community, came against them and they prevented this from happening, which is the Jungle Bachao movement. 1983 was the Apico movement. It was started in the Pandurang Hegde by Pandurang Hegde in Karnataka. Apico is a term which expresses one's affection towards trees. So in the Apico movement, again, in just like in Chipko movement, people they hugged the trees and they prevented the trees from being falling down. Narmada Bachao movement, it happened to protect the Narmada River, because the local people and the environmentalists, they actually protected the Narmada from the building of the dams and for the production of hydroelectricity. So some of the important people that played a role was Medha Patkar, Arundhati Roy, Baba Amte, and Amir Khan. These are some people who played a very important role in the Narmada Bachao movement in 1985. And then 1980s and 90s, there is this Tehri Dam conflict, in which the locals they protected against building of the dam in Tehri region, which is a very sensitive region when it comes to earthquakes and seismic activity. And the dam would have led to the submergence of all the nearby forest regions, and that is why this conflict happened. Let's look at some of the environmentalists of India. Some people I already mentioned, Sundarlal Bahuguna, who was a very important part who actually pioneered the Chipko movement. He said ecology is economy. Medha Patkar, who played an important role in Narmada Bachao movement, also did Satluj Bachao, Punjab Bachao movements as well. Salim Ali, who's the Birdman of India, he has played a very important role as a conservationist of bird species in India. And then our own Mahatma Gandhi, who actually was not really an environmentalist, but still had a lot of say. And in his books, he very strongly talked about nature, and he very famously said that the world has enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Right. So there are some environmentalists of India. And now this was all about this week, and this was all the concepts that are covered during the week, and there was a short recap about what has happened during the entire course. And I hope that you enjoyed this course of I think biology, and this very basic course, which is a very interactive and very fun course in which they covered a wide array of topics. They talked about urban landscapes, they talked about the basic biogeochemical cycles, they talked about genetics, talked about central dogma, talked about cell duplication, different types of cells. They talked about animal behavior, they talked about scientific process and how science is carried out by researchers. They talked about cancer, how cancer is spreading, and how research is carried out in cancer. They brought in different scientists for discussions, and so it was a very interesting and very nicely curated course, I would say. And so this is our last Q&A session for this tutorial. I will put forth 15 questions for you to answer so that you get a feel for this week's lectures. Number one, what does nature relatedness refer to? So what is nature relatedness? Is it how often you go to school, how many plants are there in your house, your emotional and cognitive connection to the natural world, or how much you know about space? So what is nature relatedness? And so, yeah, the correct answer is that your emotional and cognitive connection to the world is actually called nature relatedness. Spending time in nature can help improve what? Internet speed, mental well being, emotional health, mobile battery life, or urban traffic. So, which of these will actually help you improve? Which actually will improve if you spend more time in nature. And so, the correct answer is, of course, the mental well being and emotional health of people will improve if they spend more time in nature. One goal of science education is to train scientists, promote belief in superstitions, help people make informed and evidence based decisions, or teach people how to plant trees. So, what is one of the goals of science education? And so, yeah, the correct answer is to help people make informed and evidence based decisions. Fourth question: which of the following is a pro environmental behavior? Littering in parks, feeding plastic to animals, using reusable bags, or burning garbage in open areas? Which of these is a pro environmental behavior? I think this should question be very clear to you guys. It's a very simple question, it's a very basic question. And the correct answer is using reusable bags. Question 5: which of these is a major cause of increase in the stray dogs in cities? Because you have too many dog parks, because there is overpopulation and there's a lack of sterilization programs, because dogs are being refused, they're refusing to live with humans, or because pet shops are giving away dogs for free. So, what is a major cause of increasing the stray dogs in cities? So, as you've guessed already, it is the overpopulation and lack of sterilization programs. Question number 6: how can communities responsibly manage stray dog populations? So, how can, as a community, we manage our stray dog populations? Should we avoid feeding them so that they can just go away? Should we capture them and sell them so that they're not stray anymore? Should we promote sterilization, vaccination, adoption programs, or should we relocate them to forests because that is where they came from? So, what is the correct answer to how can communities play a responsible role in managing stray dog populations? And so, yes, the correct answer is promoting sterilization, vaccination, and adoption programs. Question number 7: which factor contributes significantly to increase the number of stray dog populations in urban settings? Is it enhanced animal control measures? Is it strict enforcement of neutering and spaying laws? Is it human abandonment and inadequate waste management? Or is it stringent pet adoption regulations? So, which of these four reasons is leads to an increase in the stray dog population in urban settings? So, yes, the correct answer is human abandonment and inadequate waste management. So, next question, number 8: what significant impact do stray dogs have on the urban ecosystem? Do they serve as primary prey for urban predators? Is their presence leads to a decrease in vermin species? They maintain ecosystem balance by controlling vermin populations, or do they have minimal influence on the trophic cascade within the ecosystem? So, what is the role uh, in what is the impact that they have on the urban ecosystems? And so, as you might have already guessed, the correct answer is that they maintain ecosystem balance by controlling vermin populations or pest populations. Question 9. What are some examples of ecosystem services? Tourism, medicine, freshwater, maintenance of genetic diversity, or all of the above? Which of these is an example of ecosystem services? And so, yeah, the correct answer to this is all of the above. What is Sundarlal Bhaguna known for? Is he known for the Narmada Bachao Andolan, Chipko movement, freedom struggle, or the environmental justice movement? Which of these things is Sundarlal Bhaguna famous for? And yeah, so the correct answer is Chipko movement. Number 11. What are the implications of capitalism? Individual rights over the community, private ownership over commons, consumerism over relationships, or all of the above? Which of these are some implications of capitalism? So the correct answer is all of the above. Yeah. So according to capitalism, individual rights are actually over that of the community. Private ownership is promoted, and consumerism takes over relationships. Which value is encouraged by both nature relatedness and science education? Dominating nature, avoiding experiments, respecting and stewardship for environment, or cutting down forests for buildings? So this is a very straightforward question. By now, you would have guessed the answer. So the correct answer is respect and stewardship for the environment. Our relationship with stray animals reflects what? Our attitudes towards cleanliness, our capacity for coexistence and compassion, our dislike of nature, our technology skills. And so, yeah, the correct answer is our capacity for coexistence and compassion. Question number 14. Which of the following best reflects the spirit of Indian environmentalism? Rapid industrial growth at any cost, ignoring the local communities, valuing traditional knowledge and community led conservation, or banning all the use of nature resources? So, which of the following best reflects the spirit of Indian environmentalism? And so, yeah, the correct answer is valuing traditional knowledge and community led conservation. Last question for today. What was the main aim of the Chipko movement? Was it to promote tourism in forests, to stop commercial deforestation, to introduce new farming technologies, or to build more roads in hilly areas? So, what was the main aim of Chipko movement? And yeah, so the correct answer is to stop commercial deforestation and to protect trees. So, this was all for today. I hope you enjoyed the lecture and I hope it was not helpful. And if you guys have any doubts, you can type them out in the YouTube comments, or you can actually type them out in the discussion forum of this course. And yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you for joining.